I only read the article and not their linked blueprint thingy. So.
All right. So we're live. Happy New Year to everyone here and to everyone out there on the internet. Today we're talking about basic income at the city level, which is a really interesting topic for me because when I talk about basic income, I tend to avoid a lot of the complicated questions that other people ask about funding and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And basic income at the level of national economy that has its own central bank is much simpler than it is to try to implement at the city level. So today we read an article some of us read an article by Catherine Thomas, who's a researcher at the Stanford Basic Income Lab, and they have put together a toolkit for cities that are exploring the idea of implementing basic income in their cities, or pilot programs for basic income in their cities. So let's do what we do and go around and start with people's thoughts about basic income at the city level. Hey, Robert. So what are your thoughts about basic income at the level of the individual city? Can it be done? What are the challenges that you see? What are the complications? How could it be useful to run, some kind of pilot program or something at the city level?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, good question. So, well, having known you for a while and had these discussions for a while, one of the things that comes to mind is that the funding situation for an individual city is different than for the nation as a whole, which is more what we've been talking about when we talk about the economic policy behind basic income. So I'm interested in talking a little bit more about that, but it seems to me like it might fall, even for you, more under the category of something where you need to find the money from some other source, and you need to either use taxes or something like that to try to fund it. I think it could still potentially be useful. So again, I think it becomes more of the kind of conversation that we're used to hearing in some of the debates and things like that, which is maybe you'd want it to replace some of the social programs, the money might come from there, maybe you wouldn't, maybe you'd want to fund it more from taxes, maybe you'd want to just see how people respond. I find that personally a little bit less interesting because I think things like Give Directly and so on, I've already looked at the fact that giving people money is helpful and it's pretty intuitive, but I think we've also talked about the fact that that's not maybe so intuitive for people, and it's come up a lot in this group, what if people, what if drug use goes up? You could actually look at that, what if how do people respond in terms of the labor market, that kind of thing. The trick for that, though, is that even at the city level, what you'd have to do is make it, I think, to look at some of those factors, you really have to make it very, very long term, which could be done at the city level, but isn't usually being done because that's so expensive. If you want to see what people do in the long term in terms of how interested they are in working or what their different behavioral habits turn out to be, I think you need to have it sort of to mimic the conditions we usually talk about. You have to be an expected thing that's going to keep on going. Because it's not going to make sense, for example, to quit your job if you're getting a basic income for the next 6 months or 2 years even, because that just, where it might if you were going to get that for the rest of your life. So those are some other things to think about. I guess one last thing to think about with that is even with that, it's weird. It's a little bit weird of a boundary because people move in and out of different cities a lot more than they move in and out of different countries. So that also makes it hard to study, I think, the effects. There are just lots of ways in which cities are not such a self-contained economic unit the way that maybe a country would be. So,
yeah.
Those are some different thoughts, some random thoughts I'm sure we'll get to.
Okay. David?
I actually have the same thought with the self-contained unit.
Mm-hmm.
It's harder to measure the impact of it within an area when you're only talking about the city, especially based on the size of the city. If Cambridge instituted it, it's a lot different than New York City instituting it, because a lot of people who live in New York City don't necessarily leave New York City.
Right.
But if you live in Cambridge, you're going to go to Boston, you're going to go to
Mm-hmm.
Somerville, you're going to go to Malden, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just the sense of scale there is different, so it's really harder to measure the impact. One of the other things I found really interesting about it is the fact that every one of these programs targets low-income people, which, in theory, is who you would start with. So, I don't have a problem with that, but I do feel like that biases the results you might be getting in an interesting way. And I feel like not having a representative sample of the people in a community really would impact your results in a way that isn't necessarily helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's kind of my other big problem. And then the idea that cities can tax, but they can't print money. And so, like Alex has suggested in the past, some combination of, well, we can create money, and like to some degree that wouldn't necessarily impact things. How much that was true, like we've had conversations about in the past, and I'm sure you thought about more than we've had our conversation. But like, the idea is that you can't contain it in the same way when you can only do it through taxation. It's just kind of, some of that money is going to leave the distinct area in which it is being dispersed, and some of that will come back also. If you give somebody in Cambridge that money and then go spend it in Boston, somebody in Boston will make extra money, and then maybe they'll spend some of that in Cambridge, but it's not one-to-one.
Mm-hmm.
So the more minute the area, the more dispersed the impact is, and the harder it is to measure the real impact of that societally, even if you can measure the impact on somebody's life.
Okay. Sultan?
I'm glad that they do different kind of experiments about it. I think that, as it is said in the article, it's those different type of experiments, they are very good to determine the local needs, because areas still have their own parameters and problems. So that's it.
Yeah. Any initial thoughts on basic income at the city level?
No, I'll pass since I just walked in and
Okay.
still looking to hear, but no, I'll let you know.
I think a lot of the same things that Bethany said. I do think that even though, like, Give Directly, I feel like it's definitely, indicated that, yeah, just giving people money is a positive. I think it's really easy for people to be like, oh, well, that works with, subsistence farmers in East Africa, but it would be different somehow in the US. And so I think there's potentially value to the city level experiments for that sort of, like, convincing people that, but I also feel like it's hard to get a sufficient level of impact. Like, you talked some about the dispersion. I think it's also to sort of capture impact when, like, if you're giving to everyone in Cambridge, like, some of those people work in Cambridge, some of them don't, and so there's a lot of weird factors to control. But it's not just the money will get dispersed various places, but people are going to react in different ways depending on so many other factors in their lives. That's not my sort of immediate intuition is oh yeah, that's a potentially helpful experiment. I was actually I'm not sure how much it is. It also, I share the intuition about giving it to especially poor people, it feels weird to be it's a basic income, but we're only really giving it to this super tiny. I was that's not a citywide pilot then. That's just poor people in a city, which is a longer title, but
yeah, and it's not always even all the poor people.
Yeah, it's in a certain neighborhood, or so it's sort of misleading to be oh, this is a citywide pilot. It's well, it's a poor people in an area of a city.
The one example was single mothers, and it's just that. I'm not saying that they don't need the money and it's not helpful to them, and etc. But I'm saying that you're not getting a good. You're not being able to, you're only looking at one group.
Yeah.
15 single mothers.
15, yeah.
Yeah.
A very specific and very small book.
Wow.
It's it is impacting their lives to be certain. $1,000 a month in, I'm sorry, I don't remember the city.
Alabama or something?
Yeah, it was somewhere in the south.
I think it was only, was it 1,000 or 500?
Jackson, Mississippi?
Yeah, $1,000 a month.
In Jackson, Mississippi, probably goes a lot further than it would in Cambridge.
Right.
But,
good point.
I mean...
Yeah, it's it's great for the people who are getting the money, the value of it as a proof of concept seems small. So I'm definitely not mad. I'm all right, any excuse the government can come up with, or Silicon Valley startups or whoever's funding this can always be oh, let's give some dollars to poor people. That's great.
Right.
But
that's interesting.
Richard.
Well, with the moving about, Y Combinators, if you live in the city at the time, you get it no matter if you move out of the state or whatever for the 18 months. And you can, well, say in Boston, there's a casino opening up, I believe, in the next,
like Everett.
Everett, yeah.
Oh, is that part of Boston?
No, it's
No,
a
it's not.
neighboring city.
Yeah,
Right over
it's
the
a
line.
metro area, but not
Yeah.
part of the actual
Oh,
city for census.
well, with the they didn't talk about this, but with the Cherokee tribal casino, they, well, all the people are located in a town or a city, and so that would be and they receive the resources for that, and that could be measured, and they have measured that since 1996, I believe.
Right.
And so that's sort of a basic income because they receive around $12,000 a year.
Right. The profits from the casino get distributed in the community.
Yeah, that's why I was thinking that the casino in Everett apparently could be used to fund a Boston basic income. And you can open other ones in Boston, other casinos or something. I don't know. And I don't know what else.
Okay. Well, that's an interesting thought. Bryant, any thoughts on? Yeah.
I just hope I'm not repeating anything, but it seems clear that the bigger it is, the better, the more obvious that the effects will be. But it also seems easier to organize it than smaller. So, but I think this sort of question of like the boundaries of an economy has come up before. It's pretty hard to draw a boundary anywhere smaller than the globe, like everybody that lives here, and eventually, everybody lives here and on Mars and on the moon and wherever. But I've actually, now that I've learned a little bit more, it seems like it's actually easier to draw a boundary around a nation just because a nation that controls its currency. So individual nations in the EU may not work out, but drawing a boundary around a nation that controls its own currency seems like it would be pretty easy to do. But only in theory, it's not easy to organize something of that scale. So all these experiments are great because eventually they might actually add up to there might be a way to take all the data as a whole and find something inside of it. But people look for what they want to find, so there may be that problem as well.
Yeah. Great stuff, you guys. I really liked Bethany's comment about the city being kind of a self-contained unit, and how do you keep
not being one unit.
Or it's not a self-contained, like you
Right.
can't make it a self-contained unit, right? And how do you keep the effects of basic income within the city, or how do you even like measure those effects? And then Elizabeth's point, especially, which I hadn't thought of, was just that the workers in your city might not be the residents of your city.
Right.
So just how that affects things is really interesting. And I think what Bryant said is right, that you can run these experiments and test certain specific things. Like maybe you have 15 single mothers in Jackson, Mississippi, and what you're trying to measure is one particular aspect of basic income, which is how do people respond over a year and a half to receiving $1,000 a month, or how would an individual kind of person respond to that? I think there are aspects of basic income that are really the effects are macroeconomic, and it can't really fully be tested at the city level. But then again, I think Bryant brought up an interesting point, is that you have this kind of continuum of like, well, there's the globe, and then there's countries, and then does the country issue its own currency or manage its own currency, and like smaller units and stuff like that. Like you could imagine, I mean, it's been true in the past that the European countries have had their own currencies. Could a city have its own currency? We have complementary currency, various complementary currencies, in existence. There's, Berkshires, and there's a bunch in England, and, stuff like that. So to what extent? So I'm interested in these kind of pilot programs in terms of like testing these various aspects. But I'm also curious about like what would it take really to get a basic income, like a full basic income off the ground that goes to every resident of your city, and then it brings up the question, and this question is true of the pilot programs as well. If you've got the money for something, like if you've got money in your budget, like you have to start thinking about, oh, well, we have this funding. Should it be going toward a basic income, or are there better things that it could be going to that are more beneficial to the people? And I think we kind of know that at the level of the overall economy, there are some things that it makes sense for the government to pay for, infrastructure, services and other types of things. And then there's some things that it makes sense to, be provided by the free market. And what the basic income does is it funds the free market. So you would, of course, want to have that balance at the city level as well. So I would imagine that it would at least be useful to have the infrastructure in place to provide a basic income, even if it's just a tiny amount, as like a standard thing that your city does. And then, you could look at how your economy is doing in various variables and tweak that amount. But you'd still have to be making this trade-off between, since you don't issue your own currency, you're using dollars, which are claims on the productive output of the economy, of the whole United States economy, or what the United States can import from other countries and stuff like that. You're kind of constrained there. But I think it's true even at the level of the overall economy. If there's ways for the government to use up all the resources so that there's nothing left for people to buy with the basic income. And at the city level, that kind of tension just becomes more obvious, because you've got these dollar tokens that you can't really issue more of that represent this trade-off. I don't know. Yeah, David.
So I actually, I was thinking about this in the context of, I opened my property tax bill in the city of Boston yesterday. Like, they sent me the quarterly tax bill, and I get a residential tax exemption because I own the house I live in Boston, and it's something like $2,700 a year. So
off of the taxes.
Off the taxes, and so in effect, the city of Boston has decided that everyone who is a homeowner in the city of Boston gets $2,700. I mean, in practice, it's hard to own a property in Boston worth less than $2,700, or with less than $2,700 of property taxes on it. So, I mean, every homeowner in the city of Boston who lives there in their house gets $2,700 from the city of Boston.
It's a flat rate independent of the cost of your house?
Yes.
Oh, that's strange.
Yeah, I believe this year is $2,600 or $2,700. And I just find that, there are a lot of studies that show how that increases wealth building over time, and how that it shows, increases home ownership in areas with that kind of option. Cambridge has a similar program, residential exemption. I don't know about other cities in the area. I know some don't distinctly, but I'm sure others do. And it's just kind of interesting how that, you can see that it is effectively a universal basic income for a subgroup of people, and what the impact of that is. And then they've done studies over the course of time that basically show that people who can afford to buy a house are the people who benefit from this, Right.
Well, yeah,
and,
you can't really benefit from it.
And it's just sort of very interesting to see the dynamics there, where it's it is effectively a universal basic income for people who have a certain level of income.
Yeah.
And only those people.
Yeah.
And how disparate that is, and how that is impacting increasing rents, because what ends up happening is they spread those taxes out to the people who live in properties that are residential but are not owner occupied.
Right. So that's interesting, and I think that's a good example of the government or the city is essentially handing out money in a way that's kind of inefficient, because it's going to people who are not necessarily going to benefit from that money the most. So this could be an example of, well, a basic income is clearly a more efficient way to be spending money into the community than giving money only to people who are already wealthy enough to own houses or something like that.
Yeah. So if the city basically said every household gets $2,700 or $2,500 or $2,000, it would be in effect a basic income for every household, not per person, but per household.
Right. And if you're just taking that same amount of money, it might end up being less, because there are a lot more people living in Boston than there are people who own their own houses living in Boston.
Yeah. I don't know what the number would be, but
But still, you would expect, in expectation, more people would be getting that money and spending it right away into the economy and benefiting from that right away.
It seems to me like, one of the things that we've talked about is how at a nation level, you argue that we don't necessarily lose that much by giving the basic income to everybody. Because it's really like resources that go into production that are the limiting factor. But if actual dollars are the limiting factor, it seems like that would push the argument much more towards targeting specific lower income people with the money instead of making it universal. Because now you're actually like giving those dollars to people that get less value out of them.
Yeah. So what I'd probably do, just because it's simpler, is still give the basic income to everyone.
And then just tax.
Yeah, and then just adjust on the taxation side rather than the basic income side.
That's a good point. And that also has the benefit of not attaching a stigma to the basic income.
Yeah, exactly. Richard, go ahead.
Well, with the $2,500, that's about how much the Alaska Permanent Fund provides its citizens every year. So, and there's only like 1 million people in Alaska, and there's however many people in Boston, 500,000 or something? 700,000? So that's not that big, much of a difference.
Interesting. One of the things I was thinking as I was like listening to everybody and reading these things is like, it seems like there's a sort of simple component, like one little piece of what we think of about basic income that isn't always the most interesting to us, but that's still kind of revolutionary to a lot of people, which is what about just giving people money without strings attached as a way to increase social welfare?
Right.
Which is kind of, I think, intellectually, like for some of us, maybe one of the more boring things, but like it seems like that's not a trivial leap for a lot of people to make, to have no strings attached money go to people. And maybe not for people here too. So it seems like some of these experiments are not so much the whole picture of basic income as we talk about it, but they're kind of like experimenting with that piece. Or even just trying to make it more palatable or more normal to give people money without strings attached as a way to kind of address income, as opposed to having a lot of qualifications and certain ways you're allowed to spend it and certain ways you're not, and this kind of thing. Yeah.
I think that's a good point. They kind of are testing something that's boring to us.
Well, and we won't assume that. That might not be boring to everybody.
Boring to me. I mean, if you give people money, they're going to be better off. That's not what's interesting to me about basic income. Yeah.
But I think there's a lot. It's a very like, it clearly has not been an intuitive idea, because our social programs now could be that like if you are under a certain income, you get money. That's it.
Right.
Like that wouldn't be that different economically from what we do now, and it would be a lot more efficient. But it's not what we do. Right. So there's clearly a strong psychology and sort of, I don't know what to call it, but there's clearly a strong precedent that's very different from this idea.
What do you mean by it wouldn't be much different than what we do economically right now?
I just mean like if you just took the exact dollars, and even if you had some qualifications like based on income, but you didn't have to be, say, looking for a job, or you didn't have to be like a woman with children, or exactly. Like basically it's more no strings attached than it is, because I feel like the mentality now is like, you have to be like deserving of it in a certain way. So you have to kind of prove that you meet like certain deservingness qualifications.
I was going to spend on that. And some of that may just be out of political correctness, which is not worth, I think, discussing here. But I think also a lot of it's just like cost. You know, individual municipalities and states have to like fund these projects.
Right.
They're like, oh, we have to pick a small group of people. We should, for some reason, make like a checklist of requirements so that we end up with a small group of people.
Right.
I think that a small group of people, well, okay, let me just say it this way. I think it might actually be worth it to try to run a study like this in a community that's as isolated as possible, like geographically or something, regardless of how many people actually live there. So imagine if you have 150 people that live in the middle of Wyoming. Right. And they're just so isolated from everyone else. I was just there, so I'm thinking about that. But I think the geographical isolation would actually help you insulate the weird like crosstalk that you get from people that work in Cambridge but live in Maine or something like that.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
I understand what you're saying.
So it's hard to do that in Boston because Boston is so huge. To get to the geographical boundary, you have to cover whatever he said, 1 million people, 700,000 people. But it's very difficult. So I think the data might actually be more interesting just because of the isolation.
If you look at an area that's isolated, though, what's going to happen is people are going to go 2 towns over to the city, quote unquote, to 8,000 people. To use the money. So then you're dispersing the impact that way. Like you can't control it like that.
Right. Like is this
I
isolated?
think you still have a better chance, but I guess
there's nowhere to spend the money in a town with 150 people. Really.
Yeah.
Right. There's a liquor store and a gas station.
Yeah.
That's
right.
true.
So where are those 150 people going to buy their stuff is the question.
The liquor store and the gas station.
And that might even be, you might even have,
So you say those communities are already self-sustaining, giving them a bunch of money is not going to necessarily.
well,
They're not
sustaining
self-sustaining
is
is the
the-
point, but
yeah,
they're
but-
sustained by outside cities.
Yeah.
right. They have even more outside trade than maybe a place like,
Okay, so
Yeah,
I just
bigger
got
city
that
would.
like backwards.
Yeah. Well, see, I know a lot of people in Cambridge that walk to work. Cambridge is the city in the United States that has the most people who walk to work in the city of in the city that they live in.
Oh,
Like, it is it's interesting in that way.
Mhm.
Like, per capita, it is the city in the United States that has that the most frequently. But at the end of the day, you still have enough people that are leaving it that like you aren't containing it to the city of Cambridge. You aren't containing it to the city of Boston. There's nowhere in the United States that is that contained where people actually would spend the money in that contained area, which is why I think that's super inefficient.
Yeah.
so one, yeah, go ahead, Richard.
I read an article. I sent it to you about the Alaska with the permanent fund. How there's those Inuit villages where they just have like one city, and it's really difficult to import things and whatnot, and so the prices of things are really expensive. So, and they can't really go anywhere. So that actually might work. That isolated.
But they still import a lot.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, if you're talking about an isolated Inuit village, then what you have is a situation where they've kind of got limited resources there. And they're probably kind of like at the, like they're using, what they can use in their resources.
They're
and
already maxed out.
They're already maxed out. So if you give them a basic income, it's not necessarily going, I mean, it might increase the amount of stuff they can import, from
But
elsewhere.
it's still going to end up
not-
going outside.
Yeah.
And that's
Well-
kind of the fundamental issue with anything
So-
like that.
What I'm trying to get at is isolation.
Yeah.
So I took a stab, and it's not
No,
really
I
quite
get what
right.
you're saying,
but I'm
but
just
yeah.
maybe Cambridge, maybe the fact that all these people walk to work is actually a better metric for isolation,
Yeah.
as it were.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, my thing is, and then you walk to work, you go buy something from a restaurant, that restaurant buys something from a farm in Western Mass. Like, again, like, it's just, like, having it be concentrated like that is really impractical, and you're dispersing it outside of the bounds of the city, which is basically diffusing the impact of it to that city. or that area.
So there's the question of how does it affect what you're measuring, and then how does it affect the sustainability of the program?
Mm-hmm.
Like, if the money is all circulating locally and then it kind of cycles back through taxes and stuff like that, then maybe you can kind of keep your program going. Whereas if everyone's spending and just, they got all this money and they're just buying stuff from outside, then the money just leaves. That can be an issue too. Go ahead, Richard.
Well, you can have like a aggression type currency that's you can only use in Cambridge or whatever, and so that way you can measure how much it's used, and that's it.
Yeah,
This is
but
what
right.
I was saying about just, if a municipality was able to just create its own currency.
which some
for the
municipalities
sake
have
of-
done.
Yeah, and I think and there's actually I read something today about people wanting to create a public bank in San Francisco. That would be kind of like a central bank, but for the city of San Francisco, and I thought that was interesting. I don't know that they were talking about having a complementary currency, but they were talking about how, like, having deposit accounts and being able to invest in things based on not the profit of the bank, but what's good for the city and stuff like that. So
A city in Michigan actually did that. A bank in Michigan started issuing currency that was only good at like a number of most local businesses in the town agreed to it, and the IRS came down and shut them down because they said we can't tax this right.
interesting.
Like, I mean, when these programs get big, the problem is then the federal government steps in and says, this doesn't work with the rest of the economy, you can't do this anymore.
Right.
Like, I'm just noting that as like a problem that you may not have realized.
So do you think that the reason that Berkshire's, which is like a complementary currency in Western Massachusetts, do you think the reason that survived so long is because it never got big and they never felt the need
I
to shut it
legitimately think it just hasn't gotten big enough for them to try to quell.
Where does that stuff ever turn? So in this Michigan example,
Yeah.
does that stuff ever turn into U.S. dollars? Like if I go to 7-Eleven and use those,
So-
are they allowed to go out? And,
Yeah, so what the
that
deal
doesn't
was,
work.
there was a conversion rate, and what would happen is you would go and you would get like 10 of these Michigander dollars for $9.
Yeah.
And then
So
they
that breaks it. That breaks the isolation. That's
Yeah.
what I'm thinking about. I was comparing this in my head to like money that you can put on your college dining hall card and
Oh, I
use
see.
at restaurants around where your college is.
Mhm.
But those restaurants get to turn around and use that as actual money. It's
Well,
like
they
somewhere
get
in
it
there.
back at like a certain percentage. They don't get it
Yeah,
back in a
either
dollar
from
to
the
dollar.
college or from the state or
Yeah,
from CAA.
they don't get it as dollar and a dollar though.
Right, but it does transform into
Yeah.
dollars. So
Yeah.
it doesn't
It's
matter.
it's a very similar principle, and I think where things start to get interesting is if you can spend them in enough places that they don't have to turn around and turn them into dollars because they can just spend them somewhere else. So now you're kind of expanding the money supply.
Mhm.
You've got this complementary currency. So, for example, with the Berkshires, the rule is that the businesses have to accept dollars and Berkshires 1-to-1. So you go to a store and you can pay in any combination of dollars and Berkshires. Now, when you go to the bank and you want to turn dollars into Berkshires, you get like a 5% bonus or something like that. And when you want to go the other way, you get like a 5% penalty.
Yeah.
So there's an incentive to kind of keep circulating it and not convert it back into dollars because you have to kind of pay to do that. So things like this, they're obviously. It's more feasible to have your own sovereign currency if you're a whole country. And it's more feasible for a European country to do it if the ECB isn't telling them they're not allowed to do it. And it's more feasible for a town in Michigan to do it if the federal government doesn't come in and shut them down. But there's, like the bigger the city you are and the bigger your economy is, the more kind of leeway you have, the more credit you have in terms of being able to borrow from the economy. Because when you're creating a currency, what you're essentially doing is you're saying, I'm printing out these things, and these are claims on what the economy can produce. So you have to be able to back that up, that your economy can kind of produce that stuff. And the bigger your city is, the more you'll be able to issue those kinds of claims. So most cities in the United States aren't issuing their own currencies, but they do, they do have municipal bonds and stuff like that. So there's certainly a limit to how much they can borrow, because if they accumulate too much debt, then people are worried that they're not going to be able to pay it back and something like that. They don't have the equivalent of a Federal Reserve standing by and saying, "Hey, we'll buy up any excess debt that you issue to keep the price, where we want it to be, and we'll issue these new dollars to just buy that debt, et cetera, et cetera." So they don't have this whole system set up, but in
sealed,
theory,
right? That system is sealed. That's what I was speaking to earlier.
It's sealed
In a way that these municipal systems aren't.
Yeah, it has like kind of a complete circuit
Yeah.
built into it. But certainly
It's not sealed to China or Russia or whatever.
right. So certainly the amount of money that the United States government can create is limited by their own credit too. Like China's not going to accept so many dollars that that it stops making sense or that kind of thing. So there is a limit there, but it's not the same limit as if the money you're using is like someone else's liability or something like that.
Oh yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Go ahead, David.
So 2 points. I was just thinking like, what is the most isolated economy you could think of? And I have to go to North Korea.
Okay.
Like, I mean, if you want an isolated economy,
They
what
do a
would
lot of trade with China.
well, they do, but they're the most isolated economy I can think of.
I don't think you necessarily need an isolated economy to see the effects of basic income, because in reality there is. I mean, maybe North Korea is an extreme example where you could get kind of isolated, but what really matters is that the people have access. The consumers have access to the product of the economy, and that includes importing from other economies that are willing to export to you. So the effects of basic, it's not like you won't see the effects if you're in a global economy and the basic income is in one country, or you won't see the effects if the basic income is just in one city. It's a matter of like, how do you get it to be sustainable?
Mm-hmm. No, it was literally just a thought, and I'm like, the only really isolated economy I can think of, it doesn't really fit. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and because they're a hardcore communist country, they don't really have the kinds of open. It doesn't behave like they're sure there are black markets and stuff like that, and you hear stories about the currency in North Korea is fake $100 bills, like counterfeit $100 bills, United States $100 bills, and that kind of thing. And there's all kinds of weird complications there. I'm
just throwing it out there.
Maybe another way to say it is we're trying to avoid like tiny experiments getting diluted into the cities that they're being run in. So isolation isn't
Yeah.
like what we're searching for. It's just like, we give people stocked and yada yada money. It's just gonna
Yeah, I guess there's different effects
dissolve.
that require different levels of like scale and comprehensibility. So like
Yeah.
whether it makes an individual person better off to have more money, like whether it increases their chance of doing drugs,
Always
or
measure an individual.
those kinds of things you can
Yeah.
measure, like even if you give it to one person.
Mhm.
But then there might be these synergistic effects where like the community has money, so like if I get money, I'm not the only person in my community that has money. Those kinds of effects, like you need to at least give it to a whole social community or something like that.
Right.
And then
Right.
there's other like synergies that could happen at the economic level, and like that might have to be more comprehensive still. So I guess it kind of depends on what you're measuring.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah,
I mean-
it's hard to measure all of it.
Yeah. So a question we might ask is, to what extent does it stimulate the economy? So if
Right.
people have more money to spend, in Chicago, they talk about Chicago as being a city that's considering a basic income pilot. People have more money to spend in Chicago. What is that money going to go to?
Right.
If it goes to them just buying stuff from elsewhere, and
Right.
it disincentivizes businesses from doing business or from trying to run their businesses in Chicago because they know they can just buy their stuff from elsewhere, then that's not good. Go ahead, Richard.
What about like World of Warcraft and handing out gold there or whatever? Would that be sort of like a model for basic income? And because you can't
Easier
really
to do
spread it
there.
out, but then you can like spend real money into World of Warcraft and get it. So I
Oh,
don't.
I see what you're saying.
I think it's similar to a basic income in that people do have like guaranteed ways they can just kind of get money. They you go on the quests or kill the monsters or whatever, and they drop gold and all of that. But then it's like, I mean, I think sort of, but it's also, you're not buying food directly with your gold, right? You're not paying your rent directly with your gold. So there's always going to be an exchange for most of the stuff that you would need in your everyday life.
I would still be interested in knowing what the
Yeah.
impact of something like that would be in
Yeah, I
a
think-
like upstate world.
Yeah, you'd just be talking about the economy of World of Warcraft. That's what you'd be measuring. You wouldn't necessarily be measuring like the individual player's well-being. Just imagine just paying everyone in World of Warcraft
Right. So
$1,000.
something that's interesting in World of Warcraft is that more gold keeps getting created, but then on the other side of things, you have a supply of goods that's infinitely expandable. Like you go into the shops, they're not going to run
There's no
out of the
scarcity.
supplies.
Yeah, that's true.
There's also like gold sinks that they repairing stuff and whatever.
Yeah, and I mean buying stuff at a shop is a gold sink as well.
How do they do that? Oh, okay.
The-
So
the
if I buy
game-
something at like a computerized store, the gold just disappears.
The gold
Yeah.
just disappears,
But
as
then
opposed
you're
to
also-
like buying in the auction house.
like-
Yeah,
or
that's the
something.
But the other thing would be like comparing buying at the auction house or like trading with
It's
other
considered
players
taxation.
versus like would players increase the amount of money that they're spending at these computerized stores, or would they spend more with each other, and how much is that proportional to? Like that'd be an interest. Like I still think that the experiment would be not great, but like it would be interesting to measure the impact of it.
Well, I mean, I think another thing that's interesting about World of Warcraft is that you have all these different realms. So people are playing in different copies of the world. So you see the economies do different things depending on what people are doing.
Yeah.
So obviously the prices in the shops are going to stay the same because that's set by the computer. But their other thing is trade goods and stuff like that, which might have a much higher price in one realm's auction house than it does in another realm's auction house and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's an interesting thing to look at. It's not quite. It's hard to kind of compare that to a basic income because all of the basic stuff that you buy in the game. Well, first of all, you're not buying your actual basic human needs in the game.
Yeah, you have to
It's a
make
game.
analogies for
Right.
everything that's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think to the extent that all of the basic stuff can just be bought in the stores that have unlimited supply, you've basically just got an economy where people are getting the basic income and they're using that basic income to tap into extra productive capacity that's not being used, but that productive capacity is infinite.
Yeah.
So you can
Or
create
you
an
could just
analogy
say that
there.
they're voluntarily being taxed. I mean, I was just thinking, like, if the money is disappearing, that's sort of like taxation.
No, because you bought something.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And I think that's similar to in our world, you go to the store and you buy something, you don't have the money anymore. and maybe that money just isn't in the economy anymore because that person turned around and bought, I don't know, a treasury security or something, and they're investing it in that way.
Yeah, but that doesn't always happen. So
it doesn't always happen, but generally speaking, like the flow of money, it goes from consumers to merchants to producers and investors, and it kind of flows in that direction.
What was that term we were talking about with Venezuela, where people invested and they took the money out, that all the profits that they were making, they took it out?
Yeah.
Was it mining the economy?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Mining,
So, I mean, like, you're talking about, like, so basically World of Warcraft itself, like the system, would be mining the economy.
The World of Warcraft system would be mining the economy?
No, I think he was saying like in the actual economy, this is also like the flow over time.
Yeah, well, so like when you go to buy groceries, go to the grocery store, somebody takes that money and puts it in a mattress. They are mining that out of the economy, and they're sitting on it, basically.
And I would say that that's the natural flow of money, and that you need a mechanism to get money back into the hands of consumers. So that can be the labor market, it can be jobs, it can be basic income, it can be borrowing.
Back to the question of like how a city would evaluate what they could afford.
Yeah.
It's complicated because you'd also have you're also competing with other cities, and if you're the only city that's doing it, you might have like really low crime rates, and so you might get a lot of economic development with people wanting to move there, that kind of thing. It'd be hard to sort of calculate that, but your schools could get really good, for example.
And your houses could get really expensive.
Your houses would probably get really expensive.
Yeah.
But you tax that, and that's part of the. I mean, usually this is good for revenue for the city.
It's interesting that David brought up this kind of homeowners bonus that Boston pays out, because you can do the opposite of that too. You can have, I don't know if anyone's familiar with Henry George and land value tax or any of that, but you can just say, okay, we're looking at this area of land, and we're imagining, calculating based on all the stuff that's around it, what would the price of that land be if it were an empty lot? And then you tax based on that. So maybe you tax 50% or 100% or 200% of what an empty lot would be worth in that spot. So that means if you're going to buy that land, it better be worth more to you, or you better make it worth more to you than what an empty lot would be in that spot. And that creates an incentive to develop for productive use of land. And certainly if what you're developing is residential units, and you want to make it profitable, then that's also an incentive to make more smaller residential units, or to maybe change the laws so that more people are allowed to live in the same unit or something like that.
So you cram everybody
Is
in.
that the
Or
Pittsburgh
just jack
thing?
the rent.
What's that?
Are you talking about the Pittsburgh thing?
I'm talking about the Somerville thing.
Yeah.
Oh, so in Pittsburgh, they actually...
Is that what they do in Somerville?
In Somerville, no more than 4 unrelated
I thought
people
you
are
meant the
allowed to
tax
live
thing.
in the same...
I'm talking about the empty lot tax.
Oh, the empty lot tax.
Yeah.
Oh, are they doing something similar in Pittsburgh?
So in Pittsburgh, they tax every lot as if it is an improved version up to a certain level in a downtown district. So if you have an empty parking lot, they tax the land as if it is a 4-story parking garage. And they're like, well, if you don't want to develop it, then you should pay taxes if it was developed to encourage development.
Yeah, I think that's a similar incentive. The idea is that the tax would be the same no matter what's on that land.
Yeah.
No matter how valuable the stuff that's actually built on the land is, the tax is going to be the same. So you better build something valuable that's actually useful to people.
That's identical to getting $2,700 for owning a house, I think, because it incentivizes the same behavior to develop a house and then own it instead of renting. Or I mean, because it's a fixed amount regardless of it's a fixed amount of money regardless. I mean,
It's
Well,
one
incentivized
is
in different
paying you
things
in
though,
one-
because the residential tax credit is to incentivize like people actually living in Boston instead of Chinese business people being like, oh yes, I will buy like this skyscraper and get and just invest in real estate in Boston.
Mm-hmm.
or just rent it
Right.
even. I mean, it incentivizes people to just own and live in a house.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think if
The
you're
incentive is going the same direction, even though the incentives
I
themselves.
think I agree with Elizabeth that it's not exactly the same. Because with this one, you're incentivizing something very specific, which is living in your house.
Right.
It's
And
not the same as development.
and it's not based on the size of the land. You could be living in a house that's, 10 square feet or something like
the
that.
one thing that it
Yeah.
does incentivize is the what you end up seeing is that people in Boston tend to only buy properties that would meet the minimum requirement of the exemption. So they tend to buy at least, like, they will not buy a property that the tax would be less than the residential tax exemption. Is actually a really interesting thing you do see.
Huh.
And you can see that over the course of time. I'm not saying it never happens, but you tend to see people. Well, if it's I think it's equivalent to about $250,000 house or condo. So people who want to live in the unit will not buy a condo worth less than $250,000 oftentimes because there's a kind of an inverse incentive there.
Because you don't get any money back, basically.
Yeah, you don't get anything extra for it, and well, if you're not going to pay taxes on it anyway, what difference does it make?
Right. It's better to buy a slightly bigger house or something.
Yeah, so you tend to see like a floor, which does increase development to some degree. So there's like that floor that is just sort of
The floor is on the value of the thing.
the
The property. Okay. It's not like the physical size of it.
Well, I mean, the size affects the value to some degree.
Yeah,
So.
but
And the land value tax isn't just for residential development either. Like
that's
if you're
something else.
building a business, it better be something that consumers are going to want to spend their money at. Otherwise, you're
So you
losing
would
money straight
think
out
that
of
like
that.
a lot of these
Yeah.
incentives would already be in place without the land value tax. So what problem is it trying to solve? Like you'd think that people already want to develop as profitable a company as they can, for example.
Yeah, but sometimes people are just holding on to land, waiting to sell it. Speculation.
So it's dealing
Then
with
there's-
like appreciation concerns, or
Yeah, and then there's also the issue of when we're talking about residential stuff, maybe you're building bigger luxury units or something like that. If there's no penalty for, I mean, people do want to.
but it seems like go ahead.
People do want to be as profitable as possible, but if you change the taxes, then it changes what's most profitable for people to do.
How does it change what size unit you would want to make?
You said that earlier. So if you might be incentivized to build more smaller units on the same piece of land because the taxes are going to be the same based on the size of the plot of land, not based on like how many units.
Right, but if you already if let's say you buy that plot of land and there's no taxes on it, wouldn't you still want to use it in the most profitable way possible if you're like a business
You do
developer
want to
or
use it in the
something?
most profitable way possible, but the most profitable way possible might be to sit on it and wait for it to appreciate and not.
So I understand that,
Yeah.
but I don't understand the question of like the size of the units. Because like if it's cheap, if you get more revenue by having smaller units,
That's
you do
not
it
the
either
only thing
way.
you could just charge way more rent too, right, and get around.
Right,
You
but
could
any of
charge
those
way
things,
more
it
rent.
seems like you would do it if you
You
could.
tend to basically every time you put a door on something, and they actually used to tax you on doors, but every time you put a door on something, you tend to increase the value of the scale of things. So every time you put a door in a building, in a unit, and whatever, you tend to have more value. I mean, within some reasonable guidelines.
So it increases your taxes.
Yeah, I mean, effectively, like if you have two 500 square foot units or 1,000 square foot unit, the two 500 square foot units will have 2 bathrooms, 2 kitchens. Bathrooms and kitchens get taxed at a higher rate, effectively, because there is more value per room.
So if you under the current system, if you're building more densely packed units, then that's increasing the value of your property more and increasing your taxes more. Whereas if you're just taxed based on the area of the land, then increasing the value of the property is not something that's going to cause you to have to pay higher taxes.
Okay, so that makes sense because it's in contrast to a different tax system.
Yeah.
I was kind of contrasting it to no tax.
So you
as a
get 2
baseline.
taxes when you own
Right.
land. You get a land tax and you get a improvements tax. And I know that if I knock down my shed, my taxes will go down by $30. I'm not going to knock down my shed to save $30 a year,
Right.
but it is an improvement on my land, and I am taxed on that improvement.
So it's kind of like what we were talking about with the value-added tax. It's a disincentive to develop valuable things.
Yeah. If the value-added tax is a tax on production, then that lessens the amount of production in the economy. And then if the improvement tax is a tax on improving your land, that's a disincentive to improve your land.
Right. That doesn't seem like a great way to do it. Or I can see some of the problems with it.
Right. Yeah. But I think you're right that people are going to always want to do the most profitable thing, and sometimes the most profitable thing is to just have one unit. Especially with this tax stuff, but even without that, sometimes the most profitable thing is to have one unit and to sell it for a lot as a luxury unit to someone who's willing to pay a lot.
Right.
I think with a basic, if you do have a basic income in your community, then that changes the structure of the demand curve.
Sure. Yeah.
So now there's a lot of people who are willing to pay a little bit more potentially, instead of one person who's willing to pay a lot more. And if you take away some of the disincentives to improve your property, then it can start to shift what's
Right.
most profitable. Yeah.
Yeah. Right, because like you said, like an extreme sort of child's example is like if you don't have anybody else who can if you don't have anyone who can afford anyone who can afford cheap apartments, you basically only have people that can afford like cheap apartments or really fancy apartments, then you're just going to make fancy apartments, right?
Yeah.
Like, but
Right.
if you have a bunch of people that can afford cheap apartments, it's different.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you're kind of moving more towards that second world with a basic.
Yeah. So this also comes back to the question of, at the city level, where do you get the money for a basic income? So a lot of times, when I talk about, a basic income, it's like, well, the government can issue currency and spend money into the economy, full stop, right? But that's not true at the level of a city. So if you have these taxes that would kind of be beneficial to your local city economy anyway, and you can raise some money through those, then that's potentially a way of funding a basic income.
Right. As one city, you can try to pull more of the dollars basically from the broader economy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Richard?
Washington D.C. has a 12.5% sales tax, so they might be able to like have a basic income there, but that also is a VAT, which decreases the production of the economy. So that's
Yeah, it's a little bit trickier with a more local economy.
Well,
I mean, a sales tax is similar to a VAT.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not the same.
Yeah.
That's actually a really interesting point, though. So, like, let's say with Boston,
Yeah.
Cambridge, etc., like a lot of people come to visit these areas,
Right.
and so like they have income coming in from an outside source that they could, in theory, tax that income, so that the people who own businesses or properties or etc. in Boston or in Cambridge would, have to pay that tax. The people from outside would be paying that tax. The people who may not live in the area would be, impacted by that collection of tax, and then you could give it to residents in such a way that even if it is diffuse and leaves the area, the people who are local are benefiting, and the diffusion isn't hurting the local economy.
Yeah. Sucking money in from elsewhere.
Yeah,
You're
you're
saying
already.
the diffusion is just counteracted by
Yeah,
tourism.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
And cities, I mean, they do try to do this. Cities try to
Yeah,
raise
yeah.
revenue, and countries try to raise revenue by bringing in business from outside and tourists and all
Yeah.
that.
That's kind of cool.
Yeah.
So maybe, yeah.
I mean, just like an idea of like another way it could potentially work at a local level. I mean, it wouldn't work everywhere though.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of cities and states are like this, right? Like they do take in they do take in quite a bit from the outside.
Yeah. Yeah, and it goes both ways, obviously, because people who live in these cities are spending money elsewhere also,
Right.
and importing things and all of that. And then the question is, like, it doesn't let us off the hook for the question of, once you have the revenue, what's the best way for the city government to spend it?
Right.
And is it a basic income?
Or is it more targeted?
Yeah. I mean, I think you can look at kind of any level, any kind of city level government spending, and ask yourself, is this particular thing better than just distributing it as a basic income? I think that can be kind of like, well, if you can't come up with an argument for why it's better than basic income, then you give the basic income. I think that's kind of a decent baseline. But there are things that cities should be spending money on, and
like
if you
public transportation.
like public transportation, and if you've come up with a clever way to raise money for the city, certainly there are going to be lots of claims on that money for valuable
Right.
things to do.
Healthcare programs like we have in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Then,
If you and I mean, like, I say we should figure out the kind of spending side and the taxation side separately. Like, the basic income should be all one thing, and then, like, if you need to raise money, you do that on the taxation side. But if you can raise money on the taxation side, again, should that money be going to a basic income? And I think the answer is some of it should and some of it shouldn't.
Right.
So I really feel like setting up the infrastructure for a basic income, like and having it be even just a small token amount and having that there, and then kind of looking at what happens as you adjust it is kind of the way to go.
I kind of feel like you're talking about basically the Laffer curve with like the scale. Like we don't know where the scale is, but it exists. And
Yeah.
the Laffer curve is basically what's the optimal tax rate to tax people at to get the most money to the IRS, basically.
Right.
Without diminishing production.
Well, no, it's just what
No,
is the
it's-
optimal tax rate to get the most money? Because if you tax people at 100%, they're not going to do anything.
Right.
And if you tax people at 99%, they're going to do what, you know what I mean? But if you tax them at 0%, then they're not going to worry about taxes. And
And you're
obviously,
not getting any of it.
but you're not getting any money.
Yeah.
So
At
So,
0%, there's no tax revenue. At 100%, there's no tax revenue. But at somewhere in between, there's like
Optimal
an
tax
optimal,
revenue,
maximal level of tax revenue. Yeah.
So that's kind of what
Find that with a market.
you could kind of try to think about an individual city trying to find that point, loosely speaking, I suppose.
You could talk about an individual city trying to move that point,
Or find that point.
or find that point. Yeah, find that point. And then my next point was going to be, and then the question is, how do some of these policies maybe move that point too?
Right.
So if you have a basic income, how does that affect the character of your economy? Does it increase tax revenues? Does it decrease tax revenues? Does it change
Right.
the optimal percentage level of taxation? You know, that kind of thing.
Totally.
And I think it's kind of hard to answer.
Yeah, and
that-
also some of the things we've talked about are that the way in which you tax can have more or less of an effect. So it's not even really just one point, because some kinds of taxes are more targeted towards hurting production than others. Like, for example, your point about taxing the land versus taxing improvements on things to have
Yeah.
a different impact on
For sure.
production.
And it's true. Yeah.
That's sort of a separate point about this Laffer curve, but it's not just really one point. You have
Yeah.
to think about the kind
no,
of
it's just
taxes.
kind of an interesting frame of context with a lot of this discussion is what's the ideal point? It's
Right.
what's the ideal point to tax at / give people money that you hit the happy medium, and it's kind of having turning a Laffer curve and having an X and a Y axis and having the taxes go one way and then the
We've got somebody up on
Yeah.
income go the other.
It's Nick. He came to one of our meetups.
that. Hi, Nick.
Hi, Nick.
Um,
Yeah. So these are all interesting questions, and I don't know that we can answer them
No, yeah.
here. But something to keep in mind is that a lot of these pilot programs that these cities are doing are not designed to be sustainable basic incomes. They're not designed to bootstrap into a full citywide basic income or to scale into something that's going to be an actual program over time. They're more like measuring and testing individual specific things. And I think what would be exciting to me is if some of these pilot programs looked a little more like something that was potentially going to be able to bootstrap into a full citywide basic income program, even if it's a very tiny amount. Just having that
infrastructure there.
that infrastructure there, yeah.
To your other point that I think you're making about how you would maximize the tax revenue. I mean, I think going back to what I was saying before, some of the social effects of a basic income could have a positive impact on things like tourism, right? Like if you have lower crime rates
Oh yeah.
and cleaner cities in other ways, you could have more tourism and more development and more sort of money coming in.
Yeah, and if the people in your city are committing less crime, they're healthier and happier,
Right.
And potentially less depressed and more interested in doing interesting things. Maybe they have the resources to start businesses and stuff like that.
Exactly.
That can make a big difference. And my hunch is that some level of basic income is going to be better than no level of basic income, even at the city level. And it's just a matter of kind of finding what that level is.
Somewhere between $1 and $1 million.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, at the very least, you could supplement or substitute for some of the social program stuff by just, like you said, counteracting it for most people with a progressive tax. And now instead of getting welfare, I'm getting that money in a way that's not stigmatized because everyone technically gets it. And then just in an invisible way, they pay higher taxes than I do, but that's not
See,
that's
that's
so
a very
obvious.
politically charged discussion, though.
Is it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's very political.
What do
that
you
conversation.
mean by political?
So,
Well, raising
every-
taxes.
So every time that a basic income has come up to a higher level of government, effectively it's actually been discussed in Congress, and Republicans are oh, you mean we can get rid of welfare and Social Security and all these other programs and just give everybody $1,000 a month? we might want to do that because then we can save all this money administering those programs, and like it sounds worth it to them. And then Democrats like, no, that's not what we mean. We mean in addition to all the programs that exist, we also want a basic income. So it's actually like very politically. The substitution factor is very politically charged.
Well, I guess so. Maybe someone can tell me how I'm wrong, but let's imagine that like all you can afford for some reason is like the current amount that you're giving to poor people. It seems like all else being equal, you would at least benefit from reducing the stigma associated with it and some of the hoops that people have to jump through. But maybe I'm missing something, or maybe that's not true. I don't know.
You guys are talking about two different things because he's saying that you would be giving the basic income in addition to all the welfare.
Well, I'm saying I'm impartial, but I'm saying that is an argument.
No. You're bringing up that situation.
And
you're
I'm
saying
not saying we
would
would substitute everything. Like for example, healthcare is not health insurance is not really substitutable so easily with basic income. But I was just saying like. Let's imagine like a sort of a worst case scenario where like your city is not able to raise very much additional money for people beyond what they're already doing. It seems like one benefit that you also have is that you're reducing like the stigma and maybe some of the hoops associated with it. That you could at least have that with no additional price tag is all I was saying.
So maybe I get less money than they're already getting, and there's going to be some people that get more than zero money.
Well, I guess I was glossing over like some of those details about who would get less or more. And those are probably important details. Yeah.
Sure.
Richard.
That's sort of like the universal credit, where some people get more money, but other people get less money than they currently do. And it's rolling out by 2023, I think it is. Yeah. But then there's other people who there's an issue with it taking like people having to wait like 3 months or something like that to finally get their money, and so they have to turn to prostitution and things.
I think yeah, that's not good.
One question we might ask Bethany is, well, not that we might ask Bethany, but that we might ask, Bethany.
I thought you were going to ask Bethany, but okay.
Well, I'm also asking Bethany.
What's your favorite color, Bethany?
Yeah, so the question I want to ask is, what if we assume that whatever city we're talking about is already maximizing their tax revenue? So there's no way to take more money from so-and-so to kind of offset the basic income. So then the question is, what do you you kind of have to cut other spending or something like that, or maybe you don't, because the basic income changes the structure of the economy such that now you're generating more tax revenue because your economy is stronger and that kind
it depends on that, I think.
But I think it's useful to think about, what if all the cities are doing everything they can to generate as many tax revenues as possible, then how do you pay for basic income?
Right.
And it could be that you're maybe reducing some of these housing benefits or other things that are actually not efficient ways to spend money. Maybe you don't have to cut other social programs right away. It could also be that if you've run all your economic models and everything, and you anticipate that the basic income is going to increase the tax revenues ultimately, then you can say, okay, we'll issue some municipal bonds and we'll prove to all the lenders that this is all sound. So you borrow the money, and then once the basic income is instituted, now you're able to pay it back. So that's another way to do it.
Doesn't that end up being zero sum though? If you give a basic income and then you end up increasing your tax revenue by the exact same amount, it just isn't all the money that you're giving to people just going to go that exact amount?
Well, it could be that if
the argument in inverse with lowering taxes.
From the perspective of the city, though, if this is not really from the perspective of the whole the whole country, but from the perspective of the city, if you're increasing tax revenue, say by tourism,
right,
then you're technically you don't care about those other people and their money, so it's kind of like net flowing to you. So for example, basic income, crime goes down, you get more tourism, you get those dollars, something
so
like that.
It changes the structure of the economy.
That's the possibility.
That you're sucking more money in from elsewhere.
We don't know if this would happen, but that was just one possibility.
It does happen in other countries. What will happen is you look at tourist zones of the various Cancun,
right,
or Jamaica or wherever, and what you end up seeing is they heavily tax the idea that you are going there to spend your tourist dollars there. But even if they heavily tax it, it's still very cheap because it's effectively a very cheap place to go visit. And then they spend that money improving the area that the tourists will come to, so that more of them will come, and they can keep those areas safe. They have armed guards and army officers patrolling the streets of some of these places to help keep them safe. because they, like that's how serious they take the safety of the tourists, which is
Right.
great. But that is funded by tax revenue.
Right.
Right.
So instead of paying for a bunch of armed guards patrolling your city protecting tourists,
Yeah.
you can
It's
just
weird, 'cause that seems like a closed loop too. to me.
But I think it's partly because like we're already in a better position in the United States where it's like if you reduced crime a lot in New York City, you probably wouldn't have to like have armed guards around New York City just to notice the effect and have people like because it's not like people are going to be flooding in from New Jersey like
right. I
mass
mean,
killing.
the basic income.
I don't know what's going
Well,
on
I
in
mean, people do
Cambridge.
want
That
to leave
could
New
be-
Jersey pretty desperately.
Well, they do, but I think
Well-
it's partly like we're maybe more with more moderate kinds of crime effects or something.
Right,
Yeah.
and you can even think of the basic income as paying your citizens not to be criminals. So instead of
Yeah.
hiring the armed guards, you're hiring the people
Right.
not to
Not
do
to
things that you have
sorry.
to protect tourists from anymore.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
they
That's
might
what I was
have people
thinking
coming in
about,
from
yeah.
out of town to come in and assault tourists out. Like it's it's
You
a,
could have that, yeah. So that's part
Yeah.
of this problem of it not being like so isolated.
yeah,
or something like that.
it's a really weird cycle. Like and like there are breaking points in it where you start to see it degrade,
Right.
but otherwise
Right.
it's a circle that gradually degrades.
But I think some of it's the
So
policing. I guess
so
you're
if-
mentioning too.
So if tourists are known to go to a certain place, then people who like to prey on tourists from all over the world will go to that place to prey on
Or
tourists.
maybe not
is what
over the
you're saying.
world, but yeah, like
Yeah.
let's say you introduce into a city. Well, people from the state outside of the city will go there. Let's
Yeah.
say you introduce
Right.
it to a state. Well, people from other states who border that state.
But
will
at the
go
same
there.
time, like if
Yeah.
you go to Chicago, like your safety in Chicago itself is pretty well correlated with like the wealth of the neighborhood that you're in, probably the apartment price of the neighborhood that you're in. So even though theoretically, like people can go from the south side of Chicago to other places, you're still less safe in that south side of Chicago area. Maybe if you're right in the poor University of Chicago,
Yeah,
which
that-
is like stuck in the middle of it. But
that's
you see
the
what I mean?
whole-
So
I get
people
what you're
travel, but
saying.
they don't travel like to enough that it totally floods out.
No,
this
I
effect,
get what you're
right?
saying. I understand what you're saying. Like there are so many other issues with that problem though that like I'm very much like cringing at like using that as an example because the south side
Maybe
of
it's not
Chicago
a good
is a
example.
world apart from the north side of Chicago.
But wouldn't there still be an? All I'm saying is like if you have a wealthier area
Mm.
where the people living there are doing better,
Yeah.
it's probably not going to be safer.
but, like, the-
right?
the-
Even if some people travel,
Yeah.
and, like try to.
Yeah, it
attack
probably
people.
will be because of distance to some degree. Like it's just
It just seems like that happens empirically. Maybe not. It seems like it's true in Boston too. Like the places where people are wealthier are also safer. I don't know if that's a police effect or.
Actually, if you actually
Or
look
what,
at the
but
statistics,
is
what
that
you
not
tend to
true?
see is violent crime is more common in areas that are poorer, and what you'll have is more burglaries, more robberies, etc. in areas that are richer.
More
So-
than in areas that are. poor.
Yes, actually, if you
Oh,
look
that's
at the
interesting.
areas that are the highest crime statistics for robberies and burglaries are like Beacon Hill.
That's interesting. So maybe I'm wrong about that.
But like violent crime is Mattapan, and it's like well, Mattapan is much poorer, so that's
So that might limit this effect of the basic income then, I guess, on safety. If people are traveling to attack them.
Traveling from poorer areas that
Yeah.
aren't receiving
That aren't
basic
like in the city or something, yeah.
I don't think it changes the fact that Beacon Hill is a better place to live. Like
But in
If
terms
we-
of tourism or something.
Yeah,
terms
she's saying
of
it
tourism.
wouldn't necessarily like reduce the kinds of crimes that are happening that are already happening in the nice places to go.
yeah.
I mean, my
I think that's
perception
right.
as a tourist, maybe it's just wrong.
So-
it's still like that
So
it does.
there's
but
two
I
things
don't
we're talking about here. There's the tourism thing,
Right.
and then there's the burglary of people who are living in those places.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Well, usually when we talk about basic income, I'm much more focused on the burglary of the people who live there and stuff. But since we're
Yeah.
doing this kind of like city thought experiment where we're worried about like revenues coming in versus revenues going out, I guess I was thinking about the effect on tourism as a way to get more revenue in that would help sustain or increase the basic income.
So I mean, when you look at the reason that tourists go to places like Jamaica is because they're great places to go to, and like David was saying,
Right.
the improvements are improving it and making it an even better place to go, and of course that creates an incentive for people who want to steal things from tourists. But overall, it's still a net better thing for tourists to be going to these places.
oh yeah.
So you might see the same
Yeah.
effect. So you might see more spending, and it's not necessarily tourism, people going to Chicago, but it could be more spending in Chicago, more business in Chicago, less poverty in Chicago. It's still a better place, and it might draw in more money. I don't think it never completely nullifies the effect. It's just that when things get better, it causes other things.
Well, but David
to-
was saying that like rates of burglary are actually higher in wealthier areas of Boston, which would kind of be a nullification.
Well,
thing.
Well, the wealthier areas of Boston are still more desirable to live in. That's why the wealthier people
they
are
more
paying to live
desirable?
and that's why
Is
people
it,
try to
though?
rob people in the wealthier areas
Right.
because they have more to
Yeah.
steal.
Wait, what?
No, but are people still going to visit those places more? Because that was my thought experiment.
Yes.
No, people don't go on vacations to Mattapan.
Yeah.
Well, that
I
was
mean, maybe
kind of my
they do,
point.
but I've
Yeah.
never known anyone to.
But I guess maybe it's not really about the crime.
Uh,
But I don't know why people like to visit.
Well, I mean, people like to visit areas that are more appealing on many dimensions, and places that are more appealing on many dimensions are also places that people like to rob more, right?
Yeah,
But-
I mean, I think we're maybe belaboring this point too much. I was just
Yeah.
trying to think of a way in which the basic income might bring more money into your city that would then
Yeah,
fund the
and I
basic
think you're
income.
exactly right.
Yeah.
I think
That's
this
all I
this
was
is
trying
not
to
something
say.
that's going to take away from that. It's just
I think I maybe
kind of an
mired
aside.
myself with very loaded, like complicated real life
my-
examples, but I was just
Yeah.
trying to make a very basic
My
point.
point with these like real life examples though is it's a circle, like like this increases, but the circle slowly dissipates because like at some point
Right.
you start seeing like the impact and the positivity expand to an area where that's not the area that people go to any or there's less incentive for those people to commit crimes because there's less incentive for them to I don't want to go to jail because my life's okay.
Mhm.
So
Right.
Yeah.
at some point that circle expands to the point where it's actually better. It's just it's a slowly expanding circle.
Yeah, I mean, that was the kind of reason that I was thinking, like, your citizens who are getting the basic income
Mm.
would be less likely to commit crimes because, like,
Yeah,
they have better lives and,
and
like,
then
that kind
people
of thing.
from outside that
But
area.
then
though,
that's
that's
the
the
question,
problem
I guess.
that you get into with it.
Yeah, and then there's the question of do people from outside the area move into the area so they can get the basic income?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
we didn't even talk about how you would decide. Like,
Yeah, how do you decide if you have a basic income at the city level, who gets it?
right.
Should people who have jobs in your city get it, even if they don't live there?
Right.
I don't know.
Is
yeah,
there
go-
a
How
Yeah.
long would you?
how long, like if the Alaskan permit, you have to live there for a year before you
Right.
start getting it.
And
And so, if you have to live there in Boston for a year before you get it, if
6
you-
months is how long you have to have your property in Boston before you start getting the residential tax exemption.
Okay.
It's just
So yeah, I mean, yeah, questions of how do you establish residency, that kind of thing. Yeah, I don't think these are unsolvable problems, and certainly if a small amount of basic income makes a lot of people want to move to your city, then that can stimulate your economy, but you wouldn't want to have it happen too fast. So maybe your initial basic income is a little bit smaller, and then as that basic income stimulates the economy, you can increase it as more people come in, and you want to kind of keep a balance and not have too big of a shock to your economy, that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, certainly there's a lot more space for people. Maybe not in Manhattan so much, but in a city like Chicago, there's space for more housing and dividing up into smaller units or that kind of
I
thing.
mean, if people try to move there.
Yeah, and there's areas obviously like south side of Chicago where maybe the real estate's a little bit cheaper and basic income makes it more appealing and the prices can be more distributed or the housing prices can even out more around the
Between
city.
north and south, you mean, or just in your little hypothetical? You mean between north and south side of Chicago?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Like, because if the crime went down because people had basic income, then maybe
Yeah,
the real
yeah.
estate prices
Well,
would
no,
go
I think I've heard this before where this has come up here before where if you give a basic income to some locale, maybe rent goes up just because all these people have free money, I'm just going to charge them rent.
Right.
well, there's also more demand because people want to come there because people
Yeah,
are getting basic
exactly.
income there, and
Well, they might just leave because of the rent. Personally.
Right.
I mean,
Well,
yeah.
if it's entirely offset, but like let's say you give somebody a basic income of $1,000 and the rent goes up by $500 a month, they're
That's
really
still a net gain.
it's still a
Yeah.
net gain, but there's also that $500 which is now going to the landlord.
Mhm.
So
No,
you're
I think the example I'm really thinking about is if you were to do this nationwide,
Mhm.
then people would just start. If I get $1,000, I'm just going to move to Atlanta or Nashville or something because I'm going to be able to use my $1,000 way better
Right.
down there.
If it's a nationwide.
Yeah.
basic
So
income,
it's
Yeah.
like if it's nationwide, then people will flow from north to south.
Right.
But and if it's in Chicago, maybe people would flow from north to south within
Right.
Chicago just because of the.
Especially,
thing.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
If you have a city, if you have a zone of your basic income where there is some range like that, like significant range of how far the dollar goes.
The grading will actually
Yeah.
Well-
resolve, I guess.
So the real thing you get into with all this, though, from my perspective, is like, let's say everybody gets $1,000 a month in the United States, and every price stays roughly where it is now. What you're still going to see is like some people will, move to Atlanta because they can go buy a house there or a condo there for $50,000, and like, well, like I can afford that with my $1,000 a month. That's no big deal.
Right.
It's actually about right. Just for the record.
Do you want to move to Atlanta?
Lived in Boston so long. No. We have family here.
but like you'd also see people who really want to stay in somewhere like Boston, and they because family and other issues and et cetera, who like is that it may not replace other programs. It may, like, there would be some prices increasing, et cetera, like there's a lot of extraneous factors. Like, so in theory, nothing else changes. People are going to move to cheaper areas, at least some people. But there are people who are going to sit there and go, I grew up around here, I don't want to leave my friends and family.
Right.
Oh,
So
yeah.
the important thing is that the people on the margins are going to move, and then that creates price pressure. So in Atlanta, it's going to cause prices to go up, and then in Boston, it's going to cause prices to go down because there's less demand in Boston.
But
right.
I guess my real thing here is what you would see is a bifurcation of people based on their economic means that is greater than now.
Yeah. I think
Really?
that's a fair prediction, but it's not like.
Well, if the poor people
it's not gonna
leave
prevent
Boston
prices
because
from
they go to
changing.
greener pastures, like places that are cheaper, then they're not going to necessarily build wealth down there because the economy's not as hot. But the people who have money and the means will stay, and they'll become wealthier because they'll also be getting this basic income.
I don't know. I mean, I think the people who move to Atlanta are going to be bringing their basic incomes with them, right? So, and the people who are already in Atlanta are going to have their basic incomes, and that's going to stimulate
it
the
seems like
economy
it
in
would make
Atlanta
the
much more
cities
than it
closer.
stimulates the economy in Boston.
Yeah, you would think that, but like
I would.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
know. I mean, what you tend to see is economic development. Like you like this is a split you can look at in the economy where like some cities are failing, even if people technically have jobs there. Like the city itself is kind of deteriorating, and the people who have technical skills and et cetera are leaving to go to cities. Like you see this in countries where it's like the doctors leave; they have brain drain.
Sure, but a basic income is not the same thing as a job either.
No, but like
yeah.
if you can be a doctor in Atlanta or a doctor in Boston, and the prices start becoming more comparable, then you might be like, well, I would rather live there because I can make more money there because people have more money there, and they might leave, and then there's less doctors.
So
in
maybe
Atlanta.
you were a doctor in Atlanta because your doctor salary was stretching a lot further.
Yeah.
And now.
And then you'd have some,
now the prices are going up in Atlanta, so you're like, oh, it's not stretching that much further in Atlanta anymore.
but
so
I can make more money in Boston because people have more money in Boston. So Boston, it's like you're going to see some counterbalances to that still.
Yeah, I mean, my hunch is that people would still want to have doctors in Atlanta, so that would maybe that you'd have to pay, the doctor would be paid more in Atlanta or something like that. I mean,
another doctor
there's-
might be like, the market is the demand is just going to shoot up. So I might.
Yeah,
stay
and everyone's
here.
going to be able to afford their health care now because they have a basic income and hopefully also,
Universal health
Yeah.
care. Yeah. Well, yeah. No,
Nice.
I'm just saying like there's countervailing winds there.
Yeah,
And, like,
there's always going to be.
Yeah, and so
But-
I don't think like you actually would ever hit equilibrium either.
Well, the economy never hits equilibrium. It's always a dynamical system or whatever. But in terms of what the equilibrium is, that equilibrium shifts. So if the equilibrium now is that New York is really, really expensive and Atlanta is really, really cheap, then depending on what your level of basic income is, it shifts where the equilibrium point would be. Even if we never actually achieve an equilibrium, it shifts what the equilibrium would be.
I guess like I just see somebody in Atlanta going, I'd rather live in Boston, and they're going to move to Boston. So like really, you wouldn't see that big net migration that you would be looking for to have things balance out.
So in order for there to be a countervailing force or a countervailing wind, there has to be a prevailing one as well. And the fact that there are going to be people who are on the margins between living in one place or living in another, like you can always come up with a scenario. Imagine a scenario where one person is going to do one certain thing for a certain reason, but ultimately what happens is that basic income improves the quality of life in Atlanta more than it improves the quality of life in Boston. So for people who are on the margins between living in one place or another, you're going to expect that in aggregate, on average, you're going to expect a migration from Boston to Atlanta.
Yeah, and I guess like if you actually look at the modern economy in the United States,
Yeah.
for various reasons, mostly social, you don't see that happening regardless of these economic drivers.
You see some of it happening, right? I mean, sometimes
Some
people
of, some
move
of
somewhere
it,
cheaper.
some of it happening, but like we move like demonstrably less than we did a couple generations ago, and that is like even if our well-being would be
Is that
better.
right?
For us.
Isn't there still an influx into the cities? Or we just kind of
Yeah,
capped out
that's-
on that?
Yeah, but it's
So-
demonstrably less than it was generations ago.
So
Really?
I think the fact that it's less, maybe Bethany disagrees, but I that's fine with me. What matters is that there are people who are on the margins, right?
Yeah,
And that's what's going to cause the effect. And then obviously the margins move when you have a basic income. So now different sets of people are on the margins than were before, because the ones who were on the margins all moved to Atlanta. I don't know.
Is that
But-
under the assumption that the basic income figure is the same in both Boston and
Yes.
Atlanta?
Yeah,
Yes.
So,
Universal.
Right. So what we started with
If
to
we're
kind
gonna
of
be theoretical.
to kind of get back to the city level,
Oops.
the analogy is that you've got different areas in Chicago that have different prices on housing and stuff like that. So the basic income is going to improve quality of life more in the cheaper areas than it is in the more expensive areas within Chicago. So you'd expect to see this kind of rebalancing within a city that has a basic income as well. But because it's such a small area and there's not a whole lot of extra land in Chicago, you might see it drive up overall average housing prices as well.
Cities could annex towns or whatever next to them, and that would have they could build apartments and things in those annexed areas.
Yeah, and I think there's lots of possibilities for development. I think there's room in Chicago to create more housing units too, but it's not going to happen necessarily all at once. You guys interested in? Well, I don't know. Does anyone have any thoughts? Because I've got some tabs open here in the article.
We're like well into this. You got a lot of tabs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I just think our discussion has been really interesting.
Yeah, we gotta
Yeah.
get to these tabs, Dave.
Okay. Well,
Right.
Waiting
You're so done with our discussion. You're like, no, really, this article.
Wait,
Well,
somebody bring tabs
I
so
feel
that-
bad because sometimes Alex feels sad when he doesn't get to.
the
Not
tabs,
always, though.
the tabs are
It's
only
fine.
ever here to inspire us.
They're just guidelines.
Yeah.
For our,
Like last week,
I-
we only
Just
went
out of
through a
curiosity,
third of
did
the
you find
tabs.
Yeah.
that people
There are
are
fewer
less
tabs.
I only found yes in the sense that I found one census report.
moving at historically
Maybe
low
that's
rates.
what you were
Yeah.
referring
Yeah.
to.
But
Yeah.
do we think maybe moving to start lower just because it's expensive to move?
But how
Like nobody
far
has any money
back?
now?
It's more social than anything is what they find in surveys.
Okay.
Like
That
people don't want.
are moving at a lower rate into cities than they used to be. Is this the
Well,
claim?
it's not even just lower rate into cities; it's a
Just
lower rate
rate
away from the area that they grew up in.
It's still higher than 1948.
Interesting.
Well, I mean, that's
It depends
That's
on what you
social
mean.
pressure
spiked
just
after
to
World War
stay
II.
where you are.
where you're from.
yeah.
Or social desire. Like
Yeah.
if
Oh,
none,
okay.
if none,
Social reason. Yeah.
Yeah.
because
There's also,
if none of your
um,
friends are leaving, and you're like,
like,
well, my friends are
It's
leaving.
It's
by
certainly
millions of
liberal,
percentage. Because remember, the
like-
population
Yeah.
jumped dramatically since World War II.
Number
It's
of
under-
movers.
whatever.
Oh,
Yeah, maybe-
percent.
maybe
Here we
political
go. Yeah,
polarization.
that's much more relevant. I see that's what's
Yeah.
going on. I wonder if they're taking into account how far people move and stuff, though.
Yeah, it's like within 50 miles. Like people aren't willing to move more than 50 miles. As a general
Really
rule.
unexpected.
Anyone?
It's not what I
Well,
would've
I mean, I
expected.
think for those people, if they live in a really expensive place, then
I mean, a lot of them live in very cheap places, and even if they can get a job somewhere else, they don't want to move somewhere where they can get a job, and that's actually a very cyclical problem in the economy right now.
yeah,
Where it's like I'm a welder. Well, there's the welding. The one place I could weld in town closed up. I'd have to go a county over. I don't want to drive that far every day, and I don't want to move, so I'm just not going
Right.
to work.
Homeownership would also decrease moving by a lot.
Yeah.
Well, the universal basic income would definitely help that dude out.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
But like that doesn't mean he's going to move somewhere where he could get a job welding.
yeah, but he doesn't need to.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he
he
wouldn't
would
need to. But I'm saying if you actually expect the universal basic income to, not just improve people's lives, but also like increase productivity of the economy, which is something you've mentioned before, then like you're still not necessarily going to get that out of it.
Relative
so-
to a guy who's not working, I think you
Right.
might.
So it's not that it's not that I'm expecting basic income to necessarily cause people to work more and be more productive in that sense. It's that I feel there's plenty of productive capacity in the economy, and that capacity is not going to be activated if consumers don't have enough money to spend.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying, but like that is not going to activate that person.
No, but he's thinking maybe there's a lot of like automation and factories that
I'm-
already exist.
yeah,
that could
Yeah,
just
there's
do all
already
this stuff.
already businesses. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm
exactly.
saying, yeah,
You don't need that
I'm
guy,
looking
is
at
what
that
you're
person as you don't
Or-
need Phil the welder from
Or
Alexa.
like
yeah.
another way Alex might think about it is like one of the reasons this guy isn't incentivized to move is that the economy doesn't need his welding badly enough to actually like pay for his moving costs, pay him a high enough salary, like all these things that would incentivize him
Yeah.
to move, or to set up a welding plant where the welders are, or whatever. Like,
Yeah.
you know, part of it is that like his skills, even if they might be great, are like not so maybe necessary for the current demand.
Yeah, fair enough.
It is one way
Yeah.
to look at why
If-
he's not
if
being
the
offered
economy
more
is
money.
Labor is a
activating-
market just like any other.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And when I talk about activating
just
productive,
like any other.
Yeah.
We had a discussion.
From the perspective of labor being a market, like
Yeah.
Yeah.
that's part of what's going on is that nobody's offering him like a huge bonus to like go move to this place and weld. You know, $1 million bonus to go weld, and he would take it. So there's some amount at which he would. I don't know if
Yeah.
he would, but like
Well,
on average,
you would
there's some
imagine,
amount.
like maybe not
Yeah.
Phil, but his brother Dave. You know?
Yeah, So anyway, yeah.
Mhm.
yeah. And when I talk about activating productive capacity, I'm not usually talking about like activating people and getting people to work who weren't working before. I think actually for the amount of stuff we're producing in our economy, there's kind of a disproportionately high amount of labor being performed right now. So it's not even that we need more people working; it's that
We need more
we need more
people
people spending.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
the thing. It's not to get more people working that weren't working. It's to get more people spending money that weren't able
Right.
to or just weren't.
Right.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. I'm just saying, like, productive capacity exists both in machines and in people,
Yeah.
Sure.
and you know,
Sure. And I think you know, if the productive capacity of the economy is constrained by labor, then that's gonna put a cap on what your optimal level of basic income is. And if you're increasing the basic income and at the same time it's decreasing people's incentive to work because they're receiving this income, then you kind of meet in the middle, and then that's where you end up. So here we go. So this is the beginning of the article. Well, at the federal level, progressives are proposing a basic income policy as part of a Green New Deal to counter soaring economic inequality. Cities across the country are experimenting to determine what exactly a basic income policy could look like and what it could achieve. For example, what are the trade-offs of different basic income amounts on desired outcomes? So, anyway, does that quote bring up any immediate thoughts for anyone?
There's something I was thinking about earlier. It's
Yeah.
like, you know, might it be possible that there's a city, you were saying maybe a basic income is actually not the best way for a city to be spending, you know, its newfound money. So maybe there are cities where universal basic income is proper. It is the best thing. And there are just other cities, other economic situations, whatever those are, that actually isn't. Or different amounts actually are best for different places.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know what that looks like.
Yeah, I think that's more how I would describe it. I would say any city or kind of any political community that you have, any economy, there's got to be, you know, some amount of funding of the market for consumers to spend money, and then there's got to be some funding of the things that the market won't provide, like infrastructure and that kind of stuff. And then there's a balance between the two, and the balance may be different in different cities.
Right.
I don't think it's ever the right answer to create jobs as a way of getting people income, because then what you're doing is you're trying to fund the market, and you're adding inefficiency to the labor market at the same time.
Wasting people's precious.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have some thoughts. Well,
Yeah.
my thoughts harken back to earlier, which is just that depending on the outcome that they want to measure, it's not clear to me whether the basic income experiments at the city level are actually going to allow them to answer that question. So if they want to know, like, are people better off, are they happier, like just the individuals who receive it without any of the synergistic effects, like they can kind of learn some of that, like we talked about, but they can't necessarily learn a lot of the other things. So that was the first thing that came to mind.
It's interesting,
Yeah.
actually. I feel like it would be really way easier to measure like psychological effects on these like small scales.
It is,
and
yeah.
diffuse, environments, because it doesn't matter. You just survey the
Right.
12 people that you've done this for.
Yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
you will. I mean, that's not statistically significant, but the information you get back is a little bit more meaningful because it is coming from the individual.
I think you can capture a lot. I think that there's
Yeah.
still like maybe 80%, and then I think there's like 10%, 20% that might come from your whole community or your whole country having a basic income, and like the synergistic effects of all of your friends having money, and like not having poverty, not having like as much crime. So
There's
you
this
can't
difference
quite.
between-
That would affect my well-being too. Like if you
Yeah.
scaled it up, so you can't quite get that, but you can at least get the effect of me having money, which I think is a lot of it.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
this difference between like aggregate economic effects and
Exactly.
psychological effects for people or small.
But I mean,
groups.
some of those are psychological effects, like just knowing that there aren't homeless people on the street that don't have any money, like
Yeah.
you know,
It's
that
good for,
and then
all-
every time I pass someone, I think, oh, I have all this money. This person has nothing. You know, like that would potentially go away with a high enough basic income, and that's not going to
Yeah.
be measured by just giving me money and not all of the homeless people.
Right.
So I'm just saying, like, there's some part of the psychology that doesn't get captured, but I agree that most of it does.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm sorry, you were waiting.
Oh no, I actually I don't remember what I was going to say, but
Sorry.
the thought I just had is like at the city level, if you had a universal basic income or a basic income, how do you decide who to include as a resident of the city? Going back to that, it's like if somebody's homeless in Cambridge, they might go back and forth between Cambridge and Boston. Do they count as either Cambridge or Boston? How do you know? And then, like, obviously, they'd rather be homeless in Cambridge if they're getting $1,000 a month just to be homeless in Cambridge, rather than be homeless in Boston.
So in terms of attracting people,
Yeah. And then if that's your guideline, then you're going to attract a lot of homeless people to come and live in, Cambridge, who previously lived in Boston or Somerville or Medford.
Do you know
Homeless people with money to spend.
Yeah, yeah, seriously.
Yeah,
like-
who
and that
knows,
would be
get-
saving the local economy probably because they don't
Right.
have. Yeah.
I mean, who knows what they would buy with that? I don't know. This is a really specific example. Be interesting. No. Like,
Some.
obviously, they buy food. But, like, how
there actually
quickly would they
Richard.
buy a residence? Like, how quickly
Oh,
would
I
they
see,
start
right.
paying rent to live somewhere? Or would
Yeah.
they just use it all for food? Or would they use it,
Yeah, and part of that depends on like how long term the basic income experiment
Yeah,
is. Because if it's only going to be 6 months, like you can't really afford to get yourself set up in a house with the
Yeah.
lease for a year or something like that.
Go
There
ahead.
actually is an experiment with that in London, where they gave homeless people some money and they saved it up and they bought houses and they bought suits and things so they can go to their job interviews and.
Oh, are you talking about the tiny house thing that they did over there?
No, that's not in
That's
London.
different.
That's in like Utah or something.
Utah.
Okay, sorry.
Alex, with
Yeah,
question.
like we really
Oh.
could just give real housing to homeless people. I'm sorry, that's like off topic, but like on this movie, giving money to people that
Right.
like medical studies, etc. are like, oh, when you ask most people like, what do they really? They're like housing, especially in places like New England where there's like a lot more severe weather than if you're homeless in like San Diego. It's like a house, and then you got like startup people being like, what if we built tiny houses and like gave them goods? Okay, where is their literal like unoccupied housing right now? That
That's already
people
there.
in? You don't need to like build them like.
But they're so cute.
Well, then, but you
little-
have to put them somewhere they don't want to be.
It's interesting because if you're giving people a basic income, now you've got this whole kind of new class of consumer that has this very specific amount of money to spend, and there's profit to be made there. So maybe instead of saying, "Oh, I've got this great like social idea, to build tiny houses for people and put them in it," people might say, "Oh, wow, there's hundreds of people or thousands of people with this amount of money to spend. I could make a profit by creating really small houses for them," right?
So this kind of reminds me of what you said about aligning the profit motive with these people's well-being. Because
Right.
like a little bit of what might be going on, I don't really know this detailed example, but like it could be that sometimes with these social projects, the real consumer is the donor, not the recipient. Whereas if you're actually giving the money to the people, like they're the consumer themselves, and so like now you're actually maybe like tailoring it to whatever housing makes actual sense.
Yeah, so
for
it's
the
not
people.
like we have put these tiny houses in this particular spot that was convenient for us.
Right,
like,
exactly. Or that the tiny houses look like a cute idea to like donors or something like that.
Right.
Because it's actually the people who are using the houses who are going to choose whether to spend their money on that. So
Yeah,
that
they're not
gonna
gonna- They're not
Right.
going to buy a house in a place where they don't want to live.
Right, especially if somebody else says, "Oh, like I know all these people have this money. I'm gonna use this existing housing or something like that."
And then that creates an incentive for the developer to build houses that people are actually going to want to live in. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to sell them.
Yeah, so the developer has to interrogate the market and be like, where are they going to want
Right.
to
Right.
As a
Yeah.
side note, like there's major issues with efficiency and efficacy in charities across the world and like just in general. And a big part of the problem is like donors are not that sensitive to effectiveness in lots of ways, which you probably already know. And so like that's a big problem that I guess would be largely solved by the people who really care about the effectiveness of the benefits are the people getting the benefits.
Yeah,
So,
because donors want to do what's sexy and
Yeah,
the
right.
nonprofit industrial complex.
Yeah.
So, like, we're doing this exciting new program.
Exactly.
Because what's
Yeah.
not sexy is funding like pencils
Right.
for children. You're like, but this new program.
Yeah, exactly. There was this
Who
thing
cares
called
if they can see?
I don't know if any of you guys have heard of the one example of this is like these play pumps. They were supposed to be like merry-go-rounds for kids that would also
Yeah.
pump water,
Yeah.
but they just turned out to be like so inefficient and so expensive, and the adults ended up having to like go and use them, and they're like, "This is so much worse than like a regular." Pump. It was just a big disaster, but it was exactly this kind of thing. It seemed like this new kind of
Harvesting the
clever
energy of
idea.
children.
It was so bad. It was a huge failure. But anyway, like that's an example of that where like it seemed like a good idea to the donor, but wasn't actually a good idea. Like the people themselves would not have purchased these play pumps over the other pumps. They like hated them, and they were much more expensive and less effective than the other ones. So it was just a big disaster. That's an extreme example.
remember
Yeah,
seeing
you get a
it
lot
go
of
up, that
like
was
sort of like
Yeah.
nonprofits as middlemen being like, what can we sell to donors? Like,
Right.
what can we be like? We have this exciting idea that you'll give us money for.
Exactly.
Because often
yeah.
not like people on the ground are like, we need X, and they're like,
Right.
well, that's not sexy.
Right.
So like, what can we do that sort of meets your needs
Yeah.
that like donors will be excited about?
And it's not always like that. I'm not trying to say all charities like this, but it is definitely a problem.
But how that kind of behavior actually gets in the way of the market.
Well, yeah, because it's not really. I mean, it's like I said, the consumer is the donor, not the recipient.
Right.
So it's not really a
It's
market in
different
the
market.
traditional way.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You're pleasing the donor, but what you ultimately care about as a society is the recipient.
Right.
So
And
it's not aligned.
It's hard to say that it's getting in the way of the market if the people who you want to be the consumers don't have any money to spend and there's no market anyway. right?
Yeah.
Like if they couldn't buy a pump anyway.
Well, like what's
then,
getting in the
yeah.
way of the market for them is them not having any money
Yeah.
to spend. It's pretty bad.
A pump is
Yeah.
better than no pump, but it's a very inefficient pump, and you could give 3 villages pumps for the cost.
Yeah.
Yes.
It was apparently really like tiring and difficult.
I mean, I would play with it. Just
I don't know. You wait till you see.
David, we're gonna send you to Athens.
Yeah, that's what happened. Like people would play with it for like 2 minutes. And
Yeah,
it was
yeah.
not that fun.
That's probably what I would do.
They should have done video games that pump water. That would've-
They should have. I don't know if they
lasted
managed to
longer.
figure that out.
Yeah.
I mean, lots of things are like super effective, like malaria nets, and I'm not.
Right.
It's not. There's exceptions, and like there are organizations that care about it.
Well,
But,
the-
yeah, we
the
need to
bill
make
number.
malaria nets sexy, but there's a lot of other infrastructure.
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
has
Some people
not-
are trying.
Yeah.
Like Peter Singer tries a lot with effective altruism and stuff. There's people who are
Yeah.
trying, but it's a more difficult thing than just like the consumers having the money themselves.
Yeah, because you're
Yeah.
trying to then sell it. You,
Mhm. Sell
this
the idea to
inefficiency
people
of like
who-
selling it.
And
to
people don't
donors.
understand like the need. Like, how do you even understand those needs? Even if you are trying to be effective and like figure out who you're trying to give to,
Yeah,
it's
and
very
people
very
talk about like
difficult.
effective charities being like, oh, well, like they should have no like overhead costs. And it's
Right.
like, okay, because you want like unpaid labor, like
Right.
the people who
It
are,
doesn't
like,
really make sense. Yeah,
It's
yeah,
like, yeah, we
exactly.
definitely shouldn't pay these doctors or teachers or anything.
Right.
Yeah.
People have weird intuitions about charities. Like the people shouldn't be paid a lot versus like they should have a cost-effective way of producing the valuable thing for the people. So yeah, there's lots of things like that. Sorry, it's a little bit of a tangent, but it really
Sorry, I
reminded
have a
me
lot
of your
feelings
point.
about the nonprofit industrial complex.
No, but I
Yeah,
brought
it's-
it up because it reminded me a lot of your point about aligning the
Yeah, no.
consumer with
And that's a huge thing.
the profit motive.
If you're trying to design something for people, you have to ask if you're really sure that you can do better than what the market can do. And sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is people aren't going to, pool together and build an interstate system, right? But, a lot
Yeah.
of times the answer is no. And it's something we really need to
Right.
think about when we're considering any kind of government program.
Isn't it so interesting though that like again back with like charity like Give Directly internationally and like Basic Income here or whatever, like it is
Yeah.
interesting that it's often like not where people start at all. It's like a much more of an afterthought or seemingly revolutionary idea. It's like, what if we gave the poor people the money directly? Like that was like a much later
Yeah.
idea. Like, it was way later. It's just so interesting that like that is not intuitive as
Yeah.
a way as a starting point for people.
And I think
It's a
it
utopian plan.
it comes a lot from just our feelings about labor and wanting everyone to contribute
And like earning things and stuff.
Yeah, and there's a reason why we feel that way. We came from
Right.
places where if not everyone worked, you'd be in trouble.
Prehistoric.
I mean, but even prehistorically, like
Yeah,
there's
you
a
have
lot
to
of like,
work to eat. That's
but you don't. But not everyone has to because
Right.
there are people, like we've dug up skeletons of people who are clearly buried by people who have like long-term injuries, or it's
Right,
like, oh, they
right.
clearly,
That's
you know,
So
so there are ways in which prehistoric that we're like, oh yes, like you cannot go and like hunt a deer, but you have a lot of value to add to the society.
And of course there's room for disability, but I think in the small scale kind of hunter-gatherer societies, there still needed to be kind of a social expectation that you worked if you could, because if there wasn't that, then even the people who weren't disabled would.
It was
Not
always
be
the
working.
same
Yeah.
class of like adolescents.
Also,
that were
knowledge.
doing work.
Knowledge was really important. There's even some theories, like, I don't know if they're super well established, but there's some theories that the reason we live so long past reproduction is to, like, have that knowledge that we pass on and things like this. So, like, now, things change so fast that the elderly often aren't holding on to such, I mean, they are holding on to valuable knowledge, but it's not as economically relevant. But, like, back then, like, even if you were physically disabled, like, you had this really valuable
like,
thing.
I have seen, like, these seasons and, like, these different places that we've been in. That's really valuable
super
knowledge.
valuable stuff. So that might have been part of it.
Yeah, Richard.
Well, with that, that's why matriarchal elephants live so long, so they can find different watering holes
Oh,
and
that's
things like
interesting.
that.
I didn't know that. Oh.
And but with not having to work in like ancient times, in the Roman Empire, in the city of Rome, they actually like gave out bread and they gave circuses to entertain the people so they didn't cause trouble.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a somewhat. I think that's come up here before. I mean, it's different from kind of the goal being to maximize the prosperity of everyone, and I think the objective is to make sure that people don't revolt and that kind of thing.
Keep them as minimally, like, what's the least amount of like bread and circus we can give them to keep them from revolting?
Circus is on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. That's the minimum.
It's also, I guess, from your perspective, economically not as flexible. Like, it's not going to unlock if there was a lot of untapped productive capacity, which I don't know if there was in ancient Rome, but it's not going to unlock it in as versatile a way because you're just giving people like very specific items.
Right. I mean, bread is like food stamps, right?
Right.
And circuses is like, I don't know, cable.
Food stamps and cable, the new Rome.
Well, I mean, like, the other thing there, though, is, like, if you look at ancient times, though, like, the productivity was labor.
Right.
Like,
That's
it was
kinda your
much
point.
more
Yeah,
distinctly
exactly.
labor than
Yeah, I
this
mean,
day.
like, land and labor were the resources.
Yeah.
Right.
And then they also had like in ancient Athens, every citizen had at least one slave, pretty much, so that the slaves did all the labor.
Right,
There you
right,
go.
exactly. So they had a lot of labor was still maybe
So the
could
slaves
stay, but they had a lot of
are like
labor.
an iPhone.
The
Right.
slaves are like a bounded version of automation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So-
But I mean, automation is, in some sense, unbound compared to I have one slave.
Right.
Yeah.
Some people even argue, and I don't know if this is well established either, but I heard once the argument that like maybe Rome was even hindered in its technological progress because of all of the slavery, because it was like less of an incentive to automate and like innovate,
Like they
because you had like very very cheap
They had
labor
a-
to do everything. So
they had a prototype steam engine, but they never developed because they had all these slaves.
right, yeah, that
I mean, you see the same thing in the South versus the North, like right around the Civil War, where it's like the North was building factories, and the South was like, well, why do we need machines to do things? We have these people over here.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the South was more agrarian, just to be fair.
Well, yeah,
Right.
but I mean, like the North was agrarian too at the time, actually.
But
I guess
the
everybody
North's
kind of was.
climate was not as conducive to being
Not as
agrarian, so
conducive,
they had
yeah.
more of an incentive to
To-
develop factories.
yeah.
And,
And
They also had-
obviously, you can build machines to farm.
But you do see,
They also had rivers and things for water wheels in the north.
Well, they were. It's still, it's still like even if you look at states like where slavery was legal and slavery was illegal right next to each other, though, you still see the factors would be located in the northern state.
Yeah, that makes
in
sense.
case you need another argument against slavery.
Yeah.
One
In case
more.
you
North still profit
that-
off
Yeah.
slavery.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, yeah.
Very
so, like,
clearly.
triangle trade. That's super
Definitely,
great.
yeah,
yeah,
Losses
yeah.
and Rom,
Mhm. So back to this quote.
We got a lot of tabs. We're not gonna get through all those.
I go straight line tonight.
I just wanted to mention that I looked at this Green New Deal document, and a lot of the basic income proponents are really like promoting, Green New Deal, proposed by the progressives, it includes basic income. It doesn't really include basic income. There's like one line about like And then, we should look at various possibilities of things to do, including this list of things, and basic income is one of them. And that's like the only mention of basic income. So
Sad.
that was not entirely unexpected, but maybe a little disappointing.
Is it mostly about like investing in green jobs and stuff like solar energy jobs or something?
Yeah, like a jobs guarantee is in there as a more concrete thing, and creating green energy jobs and that kind of stuff. I think the thinking behind it goes that, hey, we need to address global warming, and that's going to require a lot of jobs. Oh, and hey, we need jobs. Let's combine the two things.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a common argument. Like that's been an
Yeah.
argument in politics for like 10 years.
More than
At least.
the argument that a lot of work needs to be done and people need a lot of jobs is very old.
It seems like a match made in heaven, though. It's pretty easy to just throw that out there just because people have been saying it for so long.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's very new to say that, labor is actually a market and you should just let it do what it wants.
Right. And people want arguments. People want additional arguments to get people to try to solve global warming too, though.
Oh, yeah.
Right, and so I think that, and that's understandable. And
Yeah,
so like the
robots
idea
aren't
that
gonna
it's
fix global warming for us.
the idea that it would create jobs is
Maybe
like
they will.
appealing across all political parties. So people like
Different
that.
kind of robot, man.
That's true.
Yeah.
If they're sufficiently smart, then they kill us all.
Yeah, that
Problem
would
solved.
eventually solve global warming. Just saying.
So, why don't we go around and get final thoughts?
What about your other tabs?
Other my other tabs?
Oh no,
Pick
no,
your
what they
favorite.
You're
are.
just gonna have to read the article and find out.
I read the article.
I read
Okay. You're just gonna have to ask me what I think.
All right, I can do that. I can do that. These poor people, they're left.
I know. What's gonna happen.
You only get to hear what Alex thinks for 2 hours.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
I mean, he never talks about Gresham or basic income outside of this meetup.
Yeah.
Never again. Only in this meetup does he talk about it.
Yeah. I guess one more comment I would have on this quote is that the trade-offs of different basic income amounts on desired outcomes. Certainly, the first few dollars that someone gets are going to have more impact than later, but
Right.
you would want to figure out what level of basic income is sustainable. If you're talking about the level of the city, that's just as true as if you're talking at the level of the entire country or the entire world. You want to figure out what level of basic income is sustainable and balance that against the other things you want your government to be spending money on. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Might it be necessary to have a world currency in order to make that work properly?
To make a worldwide basic income work properly?
Yeah, just because of the
Yeah.
whole, flow of money circle where, taxation is taking it out, creating the actual value of the currency. And
Yeah, and I think even more
the
fun.
way that it's been explained to me with the government and the banking system in America.
Yeah, if it's all coming from one source, then you would kind of expect it to be all backed by the same credit. So therefore, all kind
Everybody
of the
speaks
same
English, everybody
currency.
uses the dollar.
Yeah.
Maybe not a utopian dream.
Yeah. I think in general the global economy would work more efficiently if it had one common currency, but you'd have to make sure that currency was adequately supporting the.
Gold coins.
Yeah.
I'm just saying the gold standard was a thing until the late 70s. Nixon killed it. Whatever.
Yeah.
Alex has thoughts about this.
I have thoughts
I
about
know
that.
you do. I've heard them before, actually.
Yeah. So I won't say them now.
Sorry.
So final thoughts on basic income at the level of the city. Any new thoughts that you had today during this discussion or anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was interesting for me to try to think about the budget constraints that we don't often talk about at the level of the country, and just delve into them a little bit more with how you might raise revenue, with how basic income might increase your tax revenue, how it might not be the best way to deal with things. And I guess the issue I brought up before, which is would there be a way to would it even make sense to try to substitute some other programs with the basic income to take away the stigma, or would basically trying to figure out who really needs the sort of tax, basically if you compensate it with taxes, really needs the right taxes and stuff, be so complicated that it would sort of amount to the same thing or wouldn't be worth it. I still haven't really figured out the answer to that. But I'm intrigued by this idea of even just the stigma reducing power of it in addition to all of the other things, which is if you compensate on the tax end instead, it's a little bit less visible, I think, maybe, or stigmatized perhaps, than whether you're getting welfare or you're getting food stamps. So that's one thought I had. Still have any other concerns about what you learned from these experiments or not that we addressed?
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of, my opening thoughts are kind of my closing thoughts also, because I haven't really, no movement has happened in them because, obviously, but basically, like, this is all very interesting, the city level basic income. I just effectively view it as completely inefficient at the end of the day for a lot of reasons, and I don't really, I think there's some knowledge to be gained on, like, the mental health impact on people and the quality of life impact on people who are receiving it as in these experiments, but none of these experiments really measure it in a way that is impactful and meaningful beyond the individual scale.
Right.
So,
And you already kind of know that if you give someone money, they're going to be better off.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
up to whatever the number is that they say now, it's like $80,000 a year.
And there's like debate about like what kind of happiness you're like measuring.
Yeah.
In that, and so like, is there even actually a ceiling effect after all?
It might just be diminishing returns, but not a total flat.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff going in there, but I'm saying, like, effectively, it's sort of like will that person be happier? Yes, I'm sure they will.
Right.
I don't feel like you really gain any knowledge about its impact on a wider scale from these experiments.
Yeah. So done.
I don't have anything.
Okay. Robert?
Yeah, I guess I thought it was interesting, the conversation, Atlanta-Boston, sort of this regression towards equilibrium. That's more region-wide, not city-specific. I also thought your point earlier with it being kind of a zero-sum game of, in a truly isolated city, you give everyone income, in theory you're going to take the same amount back in taxation, but then
That would never actually happen because there's holes everywhere.
Right. So I thought that was interesting until you brought in the point, well, you're also going to have the outside money flowing in as well, and that's when you truly realize the game. So
Yeah.
learned some stuff. Thought it was interesting talk. I still don't know if it'd be effective or not. That's all.
I mean, obviously, there's all the stuff that we like can't actually answer. Think of it slightly more nuanced. Understand sort of some of the issues that one would need to wrestle with for a citywide. I think it's like sort of unrelated to, but one thing that was mean as we were talking about like developments, but sort of like what are we saying is a social good or not? To be like, oh, so there's is it inherently making better use of land? To be like, okay, we're going to put like a ton of small occupancy things. To be like, oh yes, like greater population density is like an inherent good. Like sort of thinking about like, okay, when we say like, is this improving? If it's like, okay, great, more people want to live here. Like, is that good? Like, is there some sort of ceiling there? Like, okay, if you just have like like skyscrapers everywhere, like there are some negative externalities of that, and so. About like, okay, so what are the social goods that we're trying to measure?
Right.
Like, is a necessary precursor to that? Like, how do you measure those? But like, what do we even think is a social good?
Right. Like, what would be your desired outcomes?
Yeah. And like, if it's like, okay, like the Jamaica example, like, oh great, so like the tourist areas are like super well off. It's like, okay, but if the rest of Jamaica, like, then it's like you're just improving things for the tourists. You're like, oh, but like these areas are so great. And it's like, but who's really benefiting from that? Because that tourism often has those negative externalities, like in Hawaii, where all the hotels are owned by the people based in the mainland, and so all the tourism money most of it doesn't go to people.
That's interesting.
Like indigenous folks who actually live in Hawaii. It goes to like white mainlanders, and like big business. So I mean, partly in the way that like all money trickles up, but sometimes they're systemically done and like cool, like the middle, like the people on the bottom are just like housekeeping staff. We're getting like no money, and the real money is going less full places.
Right.
Well, I thought it was my idea about having a basic income in like a digital environment, like a World of Warcraft or something. I thought that was interesting, sort of like that weird plague thing that happened in World of Warcraft, and how they wanted to use that to study communicable diseases. And so So,
Talking about the zombie thing.
No, there's a plague that you could go fight a boss, and if you got it, you would hearth back to the city and give it to other people in the city. And that actually is something that you see with people did do that with like HIV, and people did that with Ebola, like the same kind of thing. Like some people chose to consciously spread the disease. And like they could actually like the scatter plot of how it spread in World of Warcraft was actually very similar to how these real people who are kind of like, well, I'm gonna die, so forget you all. Actually,
So it's fun to just like spread it to other people.
In the game, people did it,
Yeah.
but they found that it actually matched how some people act in real life too. Like
Interesting.
proportionally, more people did in the game, but
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Brian.
I think I got some nice perspective on like all the holes in the little like closed loops that I see, you know, when I first look at all that. I think that I basically agree with you that it's, you know, it's hard to, it's gonna be hard to get any really meaningful aggregate information out of, or knowledge, I'll say knowledge, out of doing these experiments one by one. I think it's ridiculous to think that any one experiment, almost no matter how large, it's just gonna come out and be the definitive, oh yeah, we like figured out all this stuff. But if you do enough of them in enough different places, I think eventually you'll just have you'll have the ability to do a meta-analysis of all that information and control for a bunch of stuff. Not everything, but you know, maybe I'm approaching that as too much of a perfectionist person that likes to plan ahead. But I think you can get useful information out of it eventually. I think there's no way that we're going to make any sense of it without doing experiments on any level. So I think it's worth it to do the experiments however you possibly can. And then, again, to finish off, I think it's clear that you'll get a lot of interesting information from individuals about how it affects their lives. And eventually you'll have a lot of individuals. And you'll be able, you know, you'll have their demographic information and all that stuff, and that may add up to something. Yeah.
Okay. So personally, I'm not super excited about the prospects of these kind of city level experiments. But if you are, I would encourage you to check out the Basic Income in Cities Toolkit document. The table of contents is here. It actually is pretty interesting. You know, they've thought about some like logistical things that I've never thought about before. But even though I'm not interested in these particular types of experiments, I am fascinated by the idea of trying to bootstrap an actual basic income at the level of the city and trying to get it going and seeing how that goes. You know, we talk about the flow of money a lot and money trickling up. And then, you know, maybe there are hacks you can put in to modify that flow and get money either coming in from outside the city or cycling back to your consumers through like taxes combined with basic income, or maybe issuing municipal debt so that soaks up some of the cash and allows you to spend more back into your community. But yeah, it's interesting to think about, like, well, if a city figures out how to implement a basic income, you know, we might be worried that city will just build a bunch of skyscrapers and everyone will move there. But then what if it also inspires another city to institute the basic income? And then that's kind of how basic income can establish itself. So there's a lot of interesting thoughts there. And I'm definitely more interested in that side of things than experimenting and seeing how people respond when you hand them free money and that kind of stuff. All right, so that's it. Next week, Bethany is not going to be here, but we're going to be talking about
I might be on the live stream.
Bethany is going to be on the live stream potentially. We're going to be talking about the Yellow Vest movement in France, which is kind of these protests that popped up in November and December. Yeah, so we'll be talking about that and seeing where basic income could potentially fit into the picture. So thanks, everybody.
Okay.
That's Wednesday or Thursday?
Next Wednesday.
Usually it's Wednesday, yeah.
Yeah.
Today was Thursday because we had something yesterday.
Yeah. Yesterday was Bethany's birthday. So.
Happy belated birthday.
Oh, nice.
Thanks.